We're kind of sitting at 29, so maybe we get started, Kelly.
Great, sounds good. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for taking your lunch hour to join us. The AIA Chicago 2030 and COTE Knowledge Community, our presentation on those things and an annual refresher. So welcome. We'll go ahead and do the general housekeeping here at the top. We're going to be presenting today, and then we'll have a little bit of time at the end for Q&A. So please, I encourage you to use the Q&A button to submit questions for the end. You're also welcome to use the chat for just general chatter back and forth amongst other attendees, but we ask that you use the Q&A for questions at the end. So let's get started. All right, first we will thank our lovely sponsors, our friend of the KC sponsor, McNichols. We're very happy to have them that help make programming like this happen. Also our supporter level sponsors, Build with Strength and NRMCA. Our friend lover sponsor, Rockwool. And just so that everybody's aware, AIA Chicago is putting on events all the time. Would encourage you to check out the AIA Chicago website with the QR code shown here to check out any upcoming events that the chapter is putting on. And also want to give a shout out to our 1869 Circle partners. They're named after the AIA Chicago, the year it was founded. And these sponsors help things happen throughout the year. And so I'm just going to give them their accolades here. That our sponsors are ABC Stone, Arup, Black Spectacles and Spectacular Design, Gensler, Goldberg General Contracting, Ice Miller, Jan, Lamar Johnson Collaborative, Lurch Bates, Lightning Protection Institute, McNichols, Modern Living, Norcon Inc., Pack-Clad Peterson, Perkins and Will, Ratio, Schuler Shook, Sierra Pacific Windows, Stantec, Taft Law, and Thornton Tomasetti. Thank you, as always, to our partners. And if you or anyone you know would like to support all the good work that our knowledge communities are doing and our affinity groups as well, and would like to join on and at any level of sponsorship, I encourage you to use this QR code to get more sponsorship information. All right, so now I'd like to introduce our knowledge community, the AIA Chicago Committee on the Environment and 2030 Commitment. This was combined a few years ago now. The efforts of both groups, they have nice synergies together. And so these are kind of our COTE goals and things that we're working on in 2025. And I forgot to say hello at the top, but I'm Kelly Moynihan, principal at Nurture Architects and one of your COTE 2030 co-chairs, and I'll call on my other two co-chairs to say hello as well.
Hi, my name is Daniel Giaconetti. I will be presenting with Kelly today. I am an architect, sustainable design leader at HED, which is an AE firm, and I'm a 2030 and COTE co-chair, and I'm also on the National COTE Leadership Group in my third year of a 3-year term. I'll turn it over to David. David, you're muted.
I'm David Wayne, City Gang Architects in Chicago, where I'm a senior project leader and also part of our sustainability task force. Also co-leading in Chicago the Carbon Leadership Forum. And back to you, Kelly. Thanks so much.
So let's dive right in. Oh, also I should mention the QR code shown here. Lots of QR codes today. This one will point you to our knowledge community specifically, which will allow you to see upcoming events that we're putting on, as well as sign up to be part of our email communication so that you can be up to date with everything that we're doing. All right, so the purpose of today's presentation is maybe for a lot of you, you're already familiar with the 2030 commitment and what that means for reporting your data and things like that. But this is our annual kind of contribution to help educate architects and our chapter of how to participate in that. So, so this might be a refresher for some of you or brand new information to some of you. So please, again, feel free to ask questions at the end. We're here to help and support your firm's efforts to be participants in the AIA 2030 commitment. So what is the AIA 2030 commitment? and what are the goals? And so the main goal is to design to reduce energy consumption. It uses 2030 as a year where we're trying to get to net zero energy, and we're trying to transform the practice of architecture in a way that is holistic, firm-wide, project-based, and data-driven. So we talk about prioritizing energy performance, and that all participating firms can have the tools and design strategies to work towards a carbon neutral buildings by 2030. So this has been in effect since 2010, and you'll see these bar charts are meant to show as 5-year increments go on, the targets for energy use is supposed to keep getting more and more aggressive of percent below baseline. And so that takes your predicted energy use by building type. There's a baseline number for that, and then what your target energy use should be below that. And so as you move from 2010 to now where we are in 2025, the target for the AIA 2030 commitment is to be at 90% below baseline, which is very, very aggressive. And we'll talk more about that later as far as like how we're doing. But the goal is that we're incrementally trying to move towards net zero energy by 2030. So why is this important? I hope I don't have to spend a lot of time talking about this, because I think probably most people on this call are aware of what's going on in the world, and have certainly not have heard before why the climate crisis is real, and that these are things we have to be tackling every day in our practice because they impact all of us across the globe. And so if we go to the next slide, another statistic that's often thrown out there is that building operations are responsible for about 30% of greenhouse gas emissions globally, and embodied carbon emissions to be another 11% of the greenhouse gas emissions globally. So what does this mean? It means we have the huge responsibility as architects, as well as opportunity to be a part of the solution with this. So we are somewhat in the driver's seat to help our projects move towards these 2030 goals, so that we can help really address the issue that a lot of what we do and what we impact is really a huge contributor to the global CO2 emissions. So with that, what is the designer's role? So how, as an architect, can we, be a part of the solution, as I mentioned? So architects and engineers have the greatest impact early in the design process, but also throughout the design process. We have to be the advocates throughout to make sure that this happens, because a lot of times we're not going to be asked to do this. Certainly, energy codes and things like that are getting better, or maybe our clients are coming to us already asking for things, but a lot of times that's not enough, or it's just not the case. So it's really our job to be the advocates and champions of this as we move through our projects. So a few ways we can tackle that through the design process are: think about adapting or renovating buildings instead of tearing them down. The most sustainable building is one that already exists. That's a quote that is said all the time, and that's because the embodied carbon of a building that's already built is something we want to address. And so if there's ways to use buildings from the get-go rather than do new construction, that's something we should be analyzing and testing rather than just assume new construction. We can certainly design for extremely high performance and resilience in the way we detail our buildings. Again, building science has already shown us how we do these things. These aren't necessarily new concepts or technologies of how we design better envelopes, things like that. So we have to prioritize those. We should be energy modeling everything as best we can. And certainly, like when you think about when you're putting together a contract for a project, like again, if energy modeling isn't required or being asked for, like maybe suggest it, in that it's like going to make the project better, and suggest that it happens early and often throughout the design process. Other things we can do is consider salvage materials instead of virgin materials, or think about where materials come from as far as like the radius from the project site. So we're also reducing the amount of carbon and conveyance of those materials to your project site. Other things that aren't energy related, but things that we can think about is how we use water on our site, whether that's water reuse capture for things like toilet flushing and things like that, irrigation, like that's things that ideas we can bring to the table early. And also thinking about using lower embodied carbon materials and materials that sequester CO2. There's lots of new exciting things happening in material development across the industry. So staying up to date with what those options are and introducing those as options within, you know, your material palettes and things like that is something that we can be in control of. And then something that we'll talk a little bit about later is having a firm sustainability action plan. And that's something that's a little more personal to your firm, but declares sort of your commitments in what your firm is going to do from a sustainability standpoint, whether that's in operations, design process, et cetera. So how do we also talk about this in benefits to our clients? So I think whether we can all agree that these are good things to do, like how do we actually make the argument? And so certain things that we'd like to suggest that can be talked about as ways to appeal to a client's interests are to talk about resiliency. I think sometimes the word sustainability can be glossed over, or, you know, it's maybe a little tired, but I think talking about resiliency as far as like durability or being able to withstand, you know, climactic events, things like that. Talking about it in a way like of maintenance and operations can often perk the ears of a client. Addressing ESG regulations, I think certainly when we talk about energy savings is dollar savings, return on investment. Those are always good arguments to make. Thinking about market innovation and how that impacts the bottom line of the project. You can also appeal to maybe their egos a little bit and say, hey, if we do these really innovative, sustainable strategies in our project, it will get you attention. It will win you awards, things like that. And I think that can attract certain clients or stakeholders' interests, as well as what the PR message is. So if you can make certain claims about a project's performance or impact or innovation, those are things that they can also sell and brag about as they, you know, get to live and use their space. So on the awards front, there's been progress at our chapter as well as nationally of having these types of strategies implemented to win design excellence awards. So there's also an appeal to maybe the architect's ego in that we should be considering these things if we want to win shiny awards that also help our own marketing and our own status, if you will, in the profession. And so all firms that submit to the 2025 Design Excellence Awards at AIA Chicago are required to have signed on to be a 2030 committed firm. There's details here that show, point you to how you do that. All firms have to be up to date with their project reporting, so they have to have actually reported their data in the most current year at the time of the submission. And also, if you're going to be submitting for the Decarbonization Award, which is definitely a more sustainability focused award at AIA Chicago, the submitted project must be reported to the DDX for that specific project. So incremental changes to award requirements are also helping to move the needle that project teams have to be addressing these things or thinking about these things when they're not only for the practice of reporting their data, but like how are they going to frame this into the narrative that they submit to win an award for a project. And so I want to talk a little bit about the framework for design excellence. These are 10 principles that AIA National uses for all of their design awards. I think these things are going to start to percolate down into AIA Chicago's design awards as well. No promises there, but we're definitely pushing for it as a knowledge community. So these are things that they make you sort of address, at least narratively, if not with actual metrics or performance data of how your project had impact in these things. So designing for integration, equitable communities, ecosystems, water, economy, energy, well-being, resources, change, and discovery. And so this is meant to say your project, if we're going to call it design excellent, it needs to be addressing all of these things. It's not just how it looks, it's how it performs, how it impacts its community, how it's specific to its own, location and climate. Like these are things we should all be considering as part of design excellence. And I'm very happy that this is starting to fold its way into how we measure what we consider good architecture. So when we talk about metrics and targets for the 2030 commitment, the two big metrics that are considered are energy use intensity, or EUI. That's measured in kBTUs per square foot per year. So that's the amount of energy use based on how big the building is, essentially. And lighting power density, or LPD, and that's measured in watts per square foot. For new buildings and renovations, the targets for this next reporting year, it's not last year, 2024, we're still at the 80% below baseline, but starting for this year, we have to be looking at 90% below baseline based on your project type. So again, this has incrementally gotten more aggressive as time has gone on. And then for interior renovations, that's where you only have to report LPD, and that should be 25% below baseline. I think this group definitely thinks that that should maybe be a little more aggressive, just because I don't think 25% is really all that difficult to achieve, but that's where the marker is now. Certainly for interior renovations, you're also encouraged and able to submit more data than just your LPD, but that's all that is actually required for an interior project. So steps to work towards these reductions. And so first, what you're going to do is use the AIA DDX, which is an online platform that we're going to see some screenshots from here in a minute, to find what the target goal is based on the use type. So if it's multifamily, that has its own base type based on the square footage, et cetera, versus it'll be a different target if it's a hospital or education. So they all are adjusted based on baselines for those project types. And so then our first challenge is to design to reduce overall energy usage. And how do you do those things early? You can look at site analysis, and that's specifically what is the climate data for that place, or what is the orientation that is possible to if it's new construction or if it's existing building, like how do we address its current orientation and how it addresses the site to optimize energy use. Model and document the P predicted, which is PEUI at each phase milestone based on ASHRAE 209. We can develop strategies to hit those goals of the reduced PEUI or LPD as you move through design phases. And then the goal is that you're reporting and sharing that data for every project every year, regardless of where it is in the design process. And so really you're only reporting your data based on what phase it's in, design phase it's in at the end of that reporting year. So while you could be tracking it throughout the year, it's if your project is at 50% design development at the end of 2024, that's sort of the stage that you would report that data in. And then for the next year, you would look at, okay, well, did that project get through to construction documents? Because that would be sort of the last time you would report the data. That would be your 2025 data. And so hopefully you would actually see like a change or got better because you're tracking it throughout the design process. So just to say a little bit about like how do we approach projects, first and foremost, you should be looking at where your project is and getting the climate data for that place. And so you can address it based on, solar orientation, how many sunny days you get in the year, how much rainfall you get in the year, cloud cover, et cetera. And that you take that into account as you're really thinking about your building form, its geometry, its window wall ratio, et cetera. Moving into determining the predicted EUI. So again, it uses a baseline, which is the COTE equivalency. Did everybody hear that? That was weird. Sorry. I don't know what that was. Anyway, so you use the COTE equivalency based on the project type, and that's where the baseline comes from. Again, this group definitely advocates for energy modeling early and often. And so your early energy analysis is done in what's usually called a shoebox model, which is sort of a white box, not a lot of articulation. So you're using that to sort of play with form, or maybe like where you're going to have glazing, et cetera. And then as design moves on, you're going to move into more detailed full energy modeling, where you're starting to introduce system information, et cetera. And that's where engineering partners come into play, because they are just as important as the architect in this design process, because they're going to help us right size our systems in tandem with as we're examining envelope and things like that. And so they really need to help to make sure that the accuracy of our systems gets put into the energy modeling. Sometimes they're actually the ones that are doing the modeling, but either way, we want them to be an active participant. So methods of reporting to the DDX. There's a couple different ways to do it on the online platform. You can either do it directly into the DDX, where you're kind of putting in inputs piece by piece, project by project. You can also do a bulk upload via like kind of a master spreadsheet or an API link from energy modeling software such as Insight 360, Cove Tool, etc. So now to sort of take a look at, this is a snapshot of what the DDX interface looks like. So this is Daniel's portfolio of some projects at, I believe, at HED. And so this just shows you kind of the splash page at the top, which is shows he's the main contact, the list of projects, what phases that you're reporting in for that year, and kind of like a snapshot of where the EUIs are at, et cetera. And so this will be tracking all of your projects. And then you'll notice as you do it for the next year, those projects will remain, and you'll sort of decide, okay, are we again reporting for this new year, or are we closing them out? So this is sort of like your main log of all of your active projects. Then, so if you're setting up a new project, so you have to enter in some basic information, name, project number. You can leave this as specific or non-specific as you want. Sometimes people want to make sure that there's some anonymity with project names and information. So, but you do need to do things like locate where it is. So it's postal code, city, climate zone, etc. What project type it is, construction type it is. Then as we move into the actual, how do we input some actual information on this? You have to do things like say, when is this anticipating to be occupied? Which energy code are you using? Either that's based on the jurisdiction, or maybe there's a more aggressive target for the project, what the occupancy calculation is, costs, construction costs and site work costs. This is really tracked as sort of like an additional layer of data when we're doing kind of national analysis or regional analysis of like how well are buildings performing based on maybe how much they're costing. So like that's not super critical. It's just sort of another layer of information. You then enter under use type and area, kind of what is the it's pretty straightforward. What is the use type of the building? You can split that up though in subsets of spaces and what the square footages are. And then what that does is then calculate in the green box below is the baseline EUI based on code equivalency. And so then that tells you what the kind of where your starting line is. And then you're going to need to hit that again, 80 or 90% below. Then this is where you start entering your actual model data. When did you model it? What tool did you use? Who did it? And then again, another sort of data point that the AIA DDX likes to track is how much are people paying for modeling, just to kind of be logging that. And then again, this helps you, this is where the baseline EUI is shown, and then your net predicted EUI, this is where you would actually enter how well you're doing. And then what do we got here? So this starts to show you as you enter in all that data, like where do you land as far as where the 2030 project target is. So that very aggressive mark you're supposed to be hitting, and then kind of where you're landing, how other projects are doing in that project type across the entire portfolio. This is another part of the DDX that is not necessarily required, but being more and more encouraged, is how you're addressing renewables on site, whether or not you have them, how they're contributing to the energy use of the project. And then same for embodied carbon. This is gaining more and more traction, and Daniel will talk more about it in a second. But this is where you actually enter in your embodied carbon modeled data, what tool you use, et cetera. And so then all this is sort of tabulated in the kind of grand energy performance of the project. And so then this is a snapshot of once you've submitted all of your projects for your entire portfolio of your firm, where you're landing. So how did your portfolio do against that baseline or the reduction below baseline? How many of your projects did you energy model? How much below the LPD did you hit? So this is sort of your snapshot of like, how well did we do? And so ideally, you wouldn't be just doing this at the end of the year and say, oh, I guess that's how well we did. Instead, it could be something that you're updating throughout the year and sort of tracking it. And so that you could make adjustments in your design process or practice, or addressing it with project teams, like we got to do better, or we should really be considering modeling earlier on projects so these numbers can get better. So this is how you kind of get a global look at how your firm is doing. So I think we'll just sort of sum up, like, how do you meet these 2030 commitments? It's a very challenging thing to do. Let's just say that outright. It's not like you, very few firms are actually even hitting the targets, but they're aggressive for a reason, because we all have to be trying to optimize our projects as best we can. So how do you do that? First thing I already said, energy model early and model often, both energy embodied carbon. This is how you actually track progress and make decisions. And so that is how you connect that performance to design excellence. Like, what story are we telling in these design decisions, and how do those contribute to the story of, is this good design, based on those the frameworks of design excellence principles I talked about earlier. This also can be a way to empower your project teams to be tracking this early and often, and seeing their progress, and really challenging them to be making design decisions or advocating for design decisions with their clients, so that you can continue to do better throughout the project. Investing in people, I think, this is a way to interact with more people in your firm, and so that they have some agency and accountability and really pride in this process, and that they can also learn some skills and tools, not only to use the DDX, but possibly become more in tune with energy modeling softwares, et cetera. Supporting an integrated design process. I think we certainly advocate for involving all the experts at the table throughout the process, because that's how you get to the best design solutions. And so that's involving your engineers, that's involving your clients, it's involving, as many people as possible throughout the process, so that you're making educated, holistic decisions. And promoting transparency. So how do you make sure that you're tracking this progress, but then doing something with it? It's sort of not being afraid of what the data shows you, and sort of saying, like, did you do good or did you do bad? But what did we learn? That's really the most important thing. And sharing that knowledge and information, not only within your firm, but then, because the DDX is tracking this nationally, it's what are we learning, trends, nationally or regionally. And then also to have a sustainability action plan. So I mentioned this earlier. This is a requirement of the 2030 commitment. All signatories have to have a sustainability action plan. There's not really like any hard rules about what that has to include, but it's really like, how is sustainability going to be woven into your firm's practice? So again, it's meant to be a document or kind of proclamation that's an actionable company-wide strategy that talks about sustainable design and how that's going to be implemented into your practice to meet these goals of the 2030 commitment. Best things to have in that are like things that are measurable, goals that, can be tracked, things like that. It's really meant to be a long-term planning tool to sort of say that we're going to be committed to this over and over again, but iterative as time goes on, like what's working, what new challenges do we need to be addressing. So it really should be like kind of a living, breathing document that your firm is kind of taking into account probably year to year, and that it's meant to be sort of shared as sort of your firm stance of how you're implementing sustainability into your design. It can also address things of like how you're, dealing with sustainability in your operations of your firm. It can be talk about things even down to like, we're going to recycle these things, or we're going to compost these. Like, it can kind of be whatever you want it to be, but it's sort of making strong commitments vocally of the things that your firm cares about, so that people can see what your commitment is.
All right, let's talk about some data.
Daniel.
Thank you, Kelly. So just to remind everyone, so all this data that Kelly was talking about, what happens to it, right? So you submit it. The deadline is typically March 31st, so it's coming up. And it's like your taxes, the data is a year behind. So the data that will be submitted in a month, in the end of March, is the data from last year. So the 2024 data, right, full year. And then AIA takes that data, they, in an anonymous fashion, they aggregate it, and then they share it out as something called the by the numbers report. Usually comes out in the late summer. So we're looking at last year's report. So all of the statistics you're going to see are the data collected from all of the reporting firms across the country for the 2024 year's project data. Actually, no, the 2020 year's project data as aggregated in 2024. And then this year, you'll be submitting the 2024 data, and this version of the report will come out in the fall. So first of all, what's going on? So since this program I don't want to say started, but yeah, since 2005, the CO2 emissions intensity of the building sector has decreased. And this data is showing that. And that's because of all the work we're doing. And then between 2010 and 2022, residential and commercial building energy consumers saved approximately $530 billion compared to what they would have saved if none of these energy efficiency strategies had been implemented by design teams. So that just shows that there's real dollar value impact as well as environmental impact. So this is an overview of the 2023 data. So across all the firms, the overall predicted reduction in energy use intensity for buildings is 50%. And as you heard Kelly say, today the target is 90%, but back when this data was done, the target was 80%. So you can see we're falling short of the target. That's the point of doing this. That shouldn't discourage you from participating because it just shows you where we need to push. It's like if you don't look at the calorie label on something you're about to eat, then you don't know how good or bad it is for you. How can you react to it? So that's why this is important. Almost 25,000 projects were reported, which is a lot. So that's great. 60%, 64% of the interior only projects met the 25% predicted LPD reduction. So as Kelly was saying, that target may actually be a little unambitious because LED lighting makes it pretty easy. And if over half of the projects are making it, maybe that target could be stretched to something more difficult. Now, this is important. There's currently over 1,000 companies that are signatories to this. Only 490 reported last year. So that's less than half, and that's a problem. It's not enough just to sign up, you have to actually report. And if you're having technical difficulties or issues that are barriers, there are plenty of people at the 2030 National Committee, as well as here at AIA Chicago, who can help you. Just reach out and we can connect you to the information you need to help break that barrier. Now, in some great news, out of the whole building projects reported, almost over 400 of them are looking at net zero. And that is ultimately the goal, right? By 2030, everything should be net zero energy. It's only 5 years away. And a lot of our projects are 5-year projects if it's something major. So we really need to be pushing for this. These are mostly US based firms, but they are reporting work around the world. So there's work in over 100 countries. Um, there are 31 companies out of the 490 here who actually met the 80% reduction target across their entire portfolio. Now, that data is not super resolved, right? That entire portfolio could be 1 or 2 net zero projects if you're a firm that specializes in small scale net zero work, right? Or it could be an entire portfolio if you're really, really pushing and only doing high performance projects. So that's a pretty good achievement. And then if you look at, so those are 31 companies met it across their entire portfolio. If you look at the total reported square footage and how that meets the 80% target, 10%. So significant, but obviously we need that to come up to 100%. And 61% of the square footage reported for whole buildings had been energy modeled. So we could see that energy modeling is definitely taking on more precedence. Okay, so this is looking at the program from 2010 until the current data. And you can see that energy efficiency was increasing and then plateaued. And, I'll bury the lead here. That 50% plateau, if you look at code equivalency and you look at the various energy codes across the country, that basically is plateauing at code equivalency. So that could mean that people are not getting beyond code, but more likely it means that not enough energy modeling is happening. Because if you don't energy model, then you can only report code equivalency. So your design, if you're in some place with an older energy code, particularly, if your design is better than code and you don't energy model it, you can't prove it. So, my first project with HED was an affordable housing project in Gary, Indiana, where the energy code was 2 versions behind the Illinois energy code. We designed it to the Illinois energy code. We weren't going to go and design something that wasn't as good as what we were used to, but we didn't have the fee to do the energy modeling. And so we reported it as code equivalent. And so if you don't actually do the energy modeling, you can't really know how well the project is going to perform, unless you go back afterwards and do post energy analysis and monitor, a year or two's worth of energy bills, which is another strategy you could use. Now, going over to the interior only projects, where again, the 2030 program is only looking at lighting and lighting power density. You can see this has been oddly up and down. Who knows what happened there in 2019, but it's about 36% on average. So the goal is 25. So as Kelly mentioned, we're actually doing well better than the average. Maybe we should push this further. Lighting efficiency is often low-hanging fruit, especially with LED lighting. Before we get into some of the deeper things like electrification and embodied carbon, I just want to pause and talk a little bit about the carbon dialogue going on, because there's a lot of language about this. Clients are asking and people are playing fast and loose, and there's a lot of confusion about what we're actually talking about. So first of all, whether you hear someone talk about carbon, decarbonization, embodied carbon, at the end of the day, what we're talking about are greenhouse gas emissions, the predominant of which is carbon dioxide. However, things like methane are actually more potent than carbon dioxide. But because the most common and most volumetric greenhouse gas emission is carbon dioxide, the way the industry does it is they express everything in metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So when you see CO2 with the little e after it, that basically is like, if we've got this much methane, what would that methane be in carbon dioxide equivalent, so that we're measuring it equally. So we're talking about greenhouse gas emissions. And then this can be divided into 3 different scopes, and this is per the greenhouse gas protocol. The first 2 scopes can be called operational emissions. So this is basically looking at energy efficiency, all of the greenhouse gas emissions that come from running a building. So the scope 1 are direct emissions from operating it on site. So if you burn any fossil fuels on site, if you have a gas boiler, if you have an oil hot water heater, if you have a diesel backup generation, all of that stuff, those are your scope 1 emissions, greenhouse gas emissions happening on your site. One of the strategies to combat this is 100% electrification. If your building is all electric, you don't have any scope 1 emissions. But depending on how green your grid is, that brings you into scope 2. Scope 2 are the greenhouse gas emissions from the energy you buy. So an all-electric building sitting in Chicago has more greenhouse gas emissions than an all-electric building sitting in Boston, where the New England grid has more renewables on it than the Midwestern grid. So one way to combat that as a design strategy is pushing for renewable energy. And if you can get all of your renewable energy on site where you have full operational control over it, then hey, my building is all electric and I'm running it on 100% clean electricity because I'm generating it myself on site. So those are your operational emissions. So when we look at the EUI, that's what that's going to. If you have an EUI of 0 or net zero building, you have 0 operational emissions. And that is the goal for 2030. But when we look beyond 2050, we also have to account for scope 3, which is the embodied carbon. So right now, those tracking fields in the 2030 program are optional, but eventually they're going to become required. And those are fields that look at what are the greenhouse gas emissions from the manufacture, extraction, transport, and eventual disposal of everything used in your building. Most of these emissions are in structure. Concrete and steel tend to be 2 of the biggest shares of that. So if you think about concrete, the aggregate is being taken out of the ground, potentially by trucks that are burning diesel. The cement, which is where most of the embodied carbon is being worked in a clinker kiln at really high temperatures. And if those kilns are being driven by fossil fuel, which most of them are, there's emissions. The trucking that takes it to the site is usually having emissions. And then if you have something that biodegrades and releases methane or CO2 as it biodegrades after, at the end of life, it's in a landfill, there's more emissions there. So that's scope 3. Scope 3 is typically called embodied carbon. So we're going to come back to this. So let's look at energy modeling. So if you look at this box and whiskers chart on the left here, what this goes to show is it shows the 2030 target, that dashed green line, and then it breaks it down by use type. And if you look at each, so let's look at the top one, assembly. The top thing is the spectrum of energy data from modeled projects, and then the bottom one is non-modeled. So what you're seeing is when you model the project, you're getting, because it's customized to the project, you're getting a much wider variety of energy use, but you're also seeing that includes in the green area a lot of projects showing better than what the code equivalent would be. So if you look in all these cases, the code equivalent is usually lower than the average if you did energy modeling. So this just goes to show part of the reason why energy modeling is so important. And you can look at the chart to the right by year of like percentage energy modeling. So for some reason, it's gone down since 2020, but we're hovering around 61% projects being energy modeled as a group of reporting firms. And then in case you're wanting to get into energy modeling and you're wondering what people are using, so that's part of the reason AIA collects this data, you can see that a lot of people are using COTE tool. The next most popular one is IES, which is what my firm uses. I will tell you in our firm that's done by mechanical engineers. It's a little bit more difficult of a tool for architects to use. I think a lot of architects prefer things like COTE tool. And for whatever reason, Insight 360 is down there at the bottom, but Insight 360 actually comes free with Revit. So if you have not done any energy modeling and you're looking to try to get into it, that might be a good place to start, just because you don't have to lay out any money to purchase something. And there are good on Autodesk's websites. There are some good YouTube webinars about how to do energy modeling with Insight 360. Okay, so we talked about why electrification can be useful. So now let's look at the grid. So 20% of the US grid currently is powered by renewable electricity. And if you look at the graph on the far right, that just shows you how that breaks down. So it's predominantly wind, but there's hydro and solar and biomass and geothermal. That's real geothermal, not what we often call geothermal in buildings, which is really a ground source heat pump. This is like tapping into the heat of the earth and using it to boil steam to turn a turbine. So that's like power plant scale stuff, not stuff you're doing on site. 933 buildings in the reported last year reported as all electric. So that's great. You have to report the fuel sources. Kelly showed you like the breakdown screen. If you just report your overall energy use without fuel sources, then how do they know if it's electric or fossil fuels? So that's an important detail, even though it's not a required field. If you want to report a project as net zero, you have to break down the fuel sources. And then you can see that out of the energy modeling, 53% of those 66 were modeled without fuel sources. So it's, and only 8% with. So it's really important if we don't look at the fuel sources, and they were modeled with fuel sources because you can't model it without it. They just weren't reported with fuel sources. So key takeaway there is if you're the person in your firm reporting the project, you actually want to get a copy of the energy modeling report from whoever did the energy model, because you probably know what the final PUI was, but you may not have the full fuel source breakdown. So you want to get that copy so you can enter it by fuel source so that you really can push on these things. And then you can look at electrification for the past 3 years of the program. So the number of projects that are 100% electric have been steadily increasing. And then you still have a lot of hybrid projects out there. Renewable energy. So there were 430 net zero projects reported. So that's a 24% increase from the year before. And that's over 2,000 projects and over 400 million gross square footage that's using renewable energy resources, which is great. Projects in the states of California, Massachusetts, Washington, and New York had the most projects reporting renewable energy, while Vermont and Maine led in the greatest percentage of projects with renewable energy resources, which I find kind of interesting because if you look at this map and you see the blue and gold, the projects that had the most renewable energy reported, those also are the states that have the most stringent energy codes typically. So it's kind of interesting that and also states where they have the cleaner grids. So it's interesting that these things are kind of going hand in hand. And you can take a look at the line graph on the left of the increase of projects with renewable energy over the 3 years of reporting. Okay, a lot of projects have been reporting with embodied carbon. Almost over 150 firms have reported over 7,000 projects. That's a 30% or an increase of 30 firms from the previous year. A lot of the projects reporting embodied carbon are new construction. some are major renovations. Every project doing a major renovation should be reporting embodied carbon because you're saving all the embodied carbon of the building structure that's already there. So that's a missed opportunity if you're not reporting that. And there's a tool called Care Tool, which is a site-based tool, CARE tool, that will help you calculate the embodied carbon of existing buildings that you're saving. So that's really important. Um, you can see the graph. So we sort of leveled out since 2022 and projects reported with embodied carbon. This just shows embodied carbon intensity. So embodied carbon per area of building by different use types. So you can kind of see, multifamily there toward the middle is more intense than some of the other ones. That's based on the data that people are reporting. Again, tools, these are the tools that people are using, predominantly Tally, but also other quicker tools and some web-based tools. These give you varying levels of resolution, like building carbon neutral doesn't give you a detailed life cycle analysis, but it'll give you big picture. I mentioned Care Tool for existing buildings. You can see that there in the middle. Why is it important? Well, because building operations is this 28% piece of the pie, but if you look at the embodied carbon that supports the building industry, you've got another 22%. So if we're going to get to zero embodied carbon emissions by 2050, which this is from Architecture 2030's website, we need to be looking at embodied carbon. And when we look at embodied carbon for this, we're really mostly only looking at the left thing, global warming potential, because that's the clear and present danger. However, greenhouse gas emissions affect all these other environmental things. And if you're doing a life cycle carbon analysis for LEED, there's a credit in LEED that's worth 4 to 5 points. You can't just look at global warming potential. You have to look at all of these metrics. So that's an important thing. So design strategies to reduce embodied carbon. First, you get a baseline carbon leadership forum. Our co-chair David mentioned earlier that he's been involved in Chicago's chapter. Carbon Leadership Forum is the leading research authority on this. Their website has all sorts of data on baselining by building type, by sector type. So you figure out what your baseline is, and then strategies to reduce it. If you can reuse a building, that's huge. Salvage materials like Kelly talked about. The next step is optimizing structure. Let's say it's a new building. The more efficient your structure is, the less embodied carbon you're going to have. It's also going to save money and save time. If you have a more efficient steel grid or you have a more efficient concrete system. So optimizing structure is important. Once you've done that, optimizing interiors. Do you need to use flooring? Can you do sealed concrete instead of adding the extra embodied carbon of putting resilient flooring over that? Is an example of that. Bio-based materials. So in the interior finish world, that's things like bamboo and cork, but in the structure world, that could be mass timber from responsibly managed forests. Those things absorb CO2 out of the atmosphere and lock them up in their structure as they grow. So that's a big way to knock down embodied carbon. And then ultimately, you're not getting to zero embodied carbon without carbon offsets. So if someone comes to you and says they want their project to be carbon neutral, you really need to have a frank conversation with them because there's no way we can design it to be as efficient as we can and squeeze as much out of it as we can. They're not getting there without purchasing carbon offsets at the end. Now, carbon offsets, some people think it's a boondoggle, but it's not necessarily a bad thing if they're credible. So as a member of the AIA Large Firm Roundtable, HED has now pledged to calculate the carbon footprint of our own office operations and offset it every year. So we went through this process last year and there's brokers out there. We worked with this company called Cloverly. They're like a stockbroker. Or a portfolio advisor, they do all of the research, they monitor the projects, and you know that when you're buying carbon credits through them, your money is actually supporting projects that will help either avoid carbon emissions or pull them out of the atmosphere. And there are avoidance credits, and that are things like going and capping leaking methane wells that companies left behind, or going and taking refrigerants from old HVAC units that are going to end up in a landfill because they're in a state where they don't regulate it and capturing them and destroying them properly, to removal credits, which are things like direct air capture or planting peat in forests and things that help do that biogenically. So carbon credits can be useful. And then just back to structure really quickly, since structure is where most of the embodied carbon is, there are a lot of things that can be done at least in my firm where we do have structural engineering in-house, I can tell you that structural engineers have sort of not often been invited to the sustainability conversation. This is a great time to bring them into that and look at things in the carbon of the concrete and of the steel and potentially alternate systems like mass timber. So there are things you can do to decarbonize your concrete structure. In the Chicago market, we have access to Carbon Cure, which is a great strategy. They capture and inject carbon dioxide into the concrete mix. Oftentimes, it can even be cost neutral as well as carbon neutral. And then these are strategies for low decarbonizing your steel procurement. So back to the 2030 program, Mythbusters, frequently asked questions. If you're thinking about like why you don't want to join, it takes too much time. It doesn't. Collecting data on a project is typically less than 30 minutes. I think the key is you want somebody embedded in the project team to do it. You don't want one person responsible for doing this across an office that has 300 projects and you're running around trying to get the data. You really want to empower people on the design team to do it. It doesn't require too many resources. It's a free program and it gives you access to people like us who do this and can help you. We don't care if your portfolio has poor performing projects. That's how we all get better. Like the data is anonymous and aggregated anyway, so it's not a reason to not report. And the 2030 goal is a goal. I mean, we want to get there, but it is a goal. It's not like you're committing and signing a blood oath that everything you design will be net zero by 2030. Otherwise, you're no longer going to be practicing. Like that's it. It's a aspirational goal, even though we want to try to get there. And it doesn't have to be complete projects, right? Kelly mentioned you want to report at every phase. And that's how you can maybe say, oh, we did an energy model at SD and we realized the project could do better. It's only SD, so now we can make some design changes that would make the project do better instead of waiting until the permit documents are out and it's too late. So when you do sign on, you're going to sign the commitment letter. You're going to have to create a sustainability action plan like Kelly showed you, and there are resources and templates available through the program to do that. And then basically you're going to start reporting your projects to the DDX, and it should help drive higher performance within your firm. This slide deck will be shared on AIA Chicago's COTE KC's website, and all of these links are live. So you'll be able to go through, refer to this, and also click on these links. But there's a link to the 2030 commitment page, to Architecture 2030, which is Ad Mazria's group where this started, Framework for Design Excellence, guides to energy modeling, ASHRAE tools, all sorts of stuff to help you. These are some really good resources. And then also the 2030 National Group has a bunch of webinars. You can see on the right, they have a couple coming up. There's one this week about bulk importing. They have Ask Us Anything, how to submit your portfolio, last minute questions. So really good stuff. And just a refresher, the deadline on the 2030 commitment is March 31st at midnight. AIA is also now doing a materials pledge. And if your firm is signed up for that, that deadline is May 31st. And the same people at AIA National who administer the 2030 commitment administer the materials pledge. So you can ask the same questions. And they also have a series of webinars and help hours coming up. And with that, we will open it up to questions from the chat or from the Q&A, because we said not to put them in the chat. Do we have any questions in the Q&A? We do not have any questions in the Q&A.
Slides, and we did record today's session, so that'll be up somewhere, or I guess Madison already responded with a link, so that's cool.
Yeah, wait, Kelly, did you say you saw questions in there? Because I seen, oh, it was answered already. That's right. Okay. Anybody else have any questions? So if you're an AIA member and you signed up for this, they will automatically report your CEUs. If you didn't give them your AIA number, or you're not an AIA member and you need to self-report, just email the group the email address that runs events for AIA Chicago, and they will help you out. And if you have any other questions, there it is. Madison just put it in there, events@aiachicago.org. Thank you, Madison. And then if you have any other questions for us about 2030 or COTE in general, you can find our contact information on the COTE, AIA COTE, AIA Chicago's COTE KC webpage. We also have a LinkedIn channel that you can find if you search for it on LinkedIn. that's another good way to have dialogue and ask us questions. Any parting questions? Any parting thoughts, Kelly?
I just want to say that we encourage everybody to either, if you are in firm leadership, make sure that you are signing up as a signatory and then maintaining that commitment, or if check with your firm to make sure that they are a signatory, and if not, convince them to do so, and be the champion within your firm to take this on. It's important that we track this data across all firms best we can, so that we can have a better idea of how the profession is doing. So I just challenge everybody to be an advocate for this. So thanks for your time over lunch. And Daniel, Dave and I are a resource to you in the future, so please reach out.
And thanks to our AIA support, including Madison, for helping us pull this off today. Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful afternoon. We'll talk to you soon.